"You don't deserve this money, Dad. You don't even understand what you're signing anymore." My son's voice cracked like a whip across the quiet dining room of Miller's Diner, and for a moment the clink of forks and knives against chipped plates stopped as every pair of eyes turned toward me, some filled with pity, others with judgment, and I sat there frozen, staring at the papers he had pushed in front of me, his words laced with venom, yet dripping in that careful performance of concern he had mastered over the past months, and I could feel my chest tighten as a younger waitress by the counter whispered something to the cook and shook her head, making me the centerpiece of a humiliation I hadn't felt in decades, not since my struggling 20s when debt collectors had pounded on my door. But this time it was my own blood drawing the blade. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 68 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, though I spent most of my later years building a life in Chicago, and I suppose I should have expected some form of betrayal in business. I've seen partners fold, investors walk, competitors steal, but I never imagined it would come from my own son, Daniel, a boy I once carried on my shoulders down Main Street during the annual Memorial Day parade, his little hands waving a paper flag while I promised myself I would build a life so solid that he would never know the hunger, the fear, the instability that scarred my youth. And yet here I was, being dressed down like some senile fool who couldn't tell one form from another. Only I wasn't as weak as he thought, because there was one thing I hadn't told him, a quiet advantage I'd been keeping in the back pocket of my mind, a secret arrangement I had made years ago when I first noticed the way his eyes lingered too long on what I had rather than who I was. I picked up the pen and looked at the documents he'd slid across to me, supposedly a power of attorney to help manage the estate in case I was slipping, but my gut told me otherwise, and the silence of the diner was filled with a kind of cruel electricity, the sort that makes your ears ring, the kind you can taste on your tongue like metal. And as I looked up at my son's handsome face, so much like mine had once been, only sharper and colder, I felt the weight of an old photograph tucked in my wallet, a photo of him at age 6, missing his 2 front teeth, smiling with chocolate ice cream smeared across his cheek, taken on a summer evening at Riverscape Park back in Dayton, a photo I'd carried every day for over 60 years, a reminder of innocence before ambition turned his heart dark, and I thought to myself that one day that picture would mean more than he could imagine. The waitress finally broke the tension with a cough. The cook banged a skillet a little louder than necessary, and Daniel leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough for only me to hear. "If you don't sign these papers, Dad, I'll make sure you regret it. You think people respect you, but they'll see you for what you are." An old man losing his grip. My jaw clenched, but I smiled faintly, something he didn't expect, because while he thought he had me cornered, I had already begun, in the quiet chambers of my mind, the long calculation of patience and payback. And as I set the pen down deliberately without signing, I felt something awaken inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Not rage exactly, but a calm, precise certainty, the kind I'd used to build everything he now wanted to steal. And I knew then that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And though the room might think I'd been shamed, humiliated by my own son, inside I was already charting the road to something far darker, far sharper, something that would leave Daniel wishing he had never mistaken my silence for surrender. The weeks after that scene in Miller's diner felt like being dragged under a current you can't fight, because Daniel wasted no time weaving his web tighter around me, telling my siblings I was slipping, convincing a few family friends that I was forgetting things, even calling my doctor to demand copies of medical files as if to prove his case. And though the doctor told me about it, shaking his head at the nerve of my son, I knew that every little seed Daniel planted was growing in the soil of people's doubts. Because in America we don't forgive age, we fear it. And men like me, who once commanded rooms, become whispered about like relics. And Daniel knew it, using it as his sharpest knife, telling my niece I'd left my car idling in the driveway for hours, or hinting to a neighbor that I'd repeated the same story twice in one afternoon. But what they didn't know was that I was letting him play his hand, because sometimes the smartest thing you can do is look weaker than you are. And I've spent a lifetime reading contracts, reading men, knowing the way ambition leaks out of their eyes even when their mouths are polite. So while he strutted around like he'd already claimed the inheritance, I was quietly setting my counterweights in place, calling in old favors from men who owed me not money but respect, making copies of certain documents, and locking away one very specific piece of proof that Daniel didn't even know existed, a proof tied to the one thing he underestimated, my memory. Still, I let him lead me through the theater of humiliation. At Thanksgiving, he raised his glass and joked that maybe next year he'd be carving the turkey in his house. And though the table laughed uncomfortably, my sister-in-law watching me with worried eyes, I only smiled, because the game wasn't about who looked strong in the moment. It was about who held the ground at the end. And I had learned a long time ago, back when I worked construction in the brutal Ohio winters, that foundations matter more than walls, because walls crumble fast, but foundations outlast storms. For a flicker of time, I thought I had scored a victory when my lawyer, an old college friend named Carl, called to say he had blocked Daniel's first attempt to transfer funds out of one of my smaller accounts, catching it in time before real damage was done. And for a night I slept easier, believing that maybe the law would work in my favor. But the very next morning I woke to the news that Daniel had persuaded my youngest daughter, Amy, to side with him, telling her that if I truly loved her, I'd step aside and let the next generation manage things. And when she looked at me across the breakfast table with that mixture of pity and conviction, my own daughter suddenly believing her father couldn't be trusted, I felt something in my chest snap, not like a bone, but like a rope holding a bridge, the sharp sting of betrayal from blood that still shared my name. And in that moment, a small victory I thought I'd won was stolen from me, leaving me hollow and shaking, wondering how many more dominoes Daniel had lined up to fall. I didn't shout at Amy, didn't try to defend myself. I only said quietly, "You'll understand one day." And she left with tears in her eyes, but inside me the calm turned colder, sharper, because if Daniel thought bringing her into his corner would weaken me, he was wrong. It only steeled my resolve. And as I sat alone that evening in my living room, the Chicago wind rattling the old windows, I pulled that photograph from my wallet, the one of him at 6 years old with chocolate smeared across his cheek, and I studied it under the lamplight, asking myself how the boy in the picture had become the man at the diner. And I made a vow right then that I would not only survive his betrayal, I would make sure he saw the cost of it reflected back in the only place he couldn't manipulate, the truth. And the truth has a way of snapping shut, like a trap if you know how to set it. The calendar became my enemy and my ally, At the same time, because Daniel had managed to push through a hearing date for conservatorship, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, and the court scheduled it for 60 days out, a neat little ticking clock that he believed would be his coronation. The moment the gavel fell and my signature, my will, my decisions became his property to command. But I've lived my life watching deadlines loom, contracts, project bids, mergers, and I knew that if I moved too quickly, I'd tip my hand, and if I moved too slowly, he'd win by default. So I let him think he was tightening the noose, letting him send smug emails about how responsibility would soon shift, and parading around the neighborhood in his new Mercedes that he pretended was bought with his own money, when I knew damn well it came from siphoning off a family trust I'd set up decades ago. But while he flaunted his victories, I was visiting people he never thought I'd remember. An old accountant who owed me a favor from the 80s, a retired banker who'd once sworn I saved his job, and quietly, Carl and I began piecing together not only Daniel's fraud, but his arrogance, pulling statements, matching dates, building a timeline so clean it could slice through his lies like glass. But here's the trick I didn't tell anyone, not even Carl. I wasn't just building a case to defend myself. I was building a stage where Daniel would destroy himself in front of everyone he thought he'd fooled. In the meantime, he grew bolder. He showed up at my house one evening with Amy in tow, waving a stack of glossy brochures for assisted living facilities, his voice dripping with fake sympathy as he told me it would be better for everyone if I considered moving out, and I played my part perfectly, letting my shoulders slump, my hands tremble just enough, nodding like maybe he was right. And when Amy hugged me on the porch, whispering that she just wanted peace, I nearly broke down, but I kept my face steady, because I knew that the deeper they believed their narrative, the more brutal the reversal would feel when it came. The photograph became my quiet ritual during those weeks. Every night before bed I pulled it from my wallet, running my thumb across the faded image, reminding myself that love can sour into greed, but it can also be weaponized, that symbols aren't just memories. They're leverage if you know when to show them, and in those private hours I began to sketch in my mind exactly how Daniel's hunger for validation would undo him. The first crack in his armor came unexpectedly when Carl told me that Daniel had submitted a forged signature on one of the property deeds, and though we blocked the transaction, I realized Daniel had overplayed his hand, leaving behind evidence that could not only void his claim but implicate him in fraud. And for a brief moment, my chest filled with triumph. But then Carl's voice lowered and he told me something that almost drove me to the floor. Daniel had listed Amy as a co-beneficiary on certain accounts, meaning that if he pulled me down, she'd rise with him, her loyalty sealed not just by persuasion, but by financial reward. And suddenly the betrayal doubled in weight, because it wasn't just my son against me, it was my daughter too, lured into his plan with promises of security. And though my heart ached at the thought of her complicity, I also recognized the brilliance of Daniel's move. He was tightening the noose not just legally, but emotionally, making sure that if I fought him, I'd risk alienating the only family I had left. That night I sat awake in my recliner, the Chicago wind whistling like a warning through the eaves, and I studied that photograph again, realizing something I hadn't before. Behind Daniel's 6-year-old smile was the shadow of my own hand holding him steady, cropped out of the frame, invisible but essential, and I understood then that just as I had once held him up, I could now let him fall, and the world would see exactly how he got there. What Daniel didn't know, what nobody knew, was that months before all this began, I had quietly recorded certain conversations, not because I suspected betrayal then, but because habit had taught me to archive everything. And those recordings, stored in a place Daniel would never think to look, held truths that, when played at the right time, would not only dismantle his narrative but reveal the cruelty behind his manipulation of Amy. And as I sat there with the photograph and the ticking clock of the court date echoing in my mind, I whispered to myself that patience was the deadliest weapon a man could own. And yet, even as I prepared the trap, Daniel scored what looked like another win. He convinced my oldest friend, a man I'd known since high school, to sign a statement saying he believed I was showing early signs of confusion, a betrayal that cut so deep I nearly faltered, and for the first time in weeks, doubt crept in, whispering that maybe Daniel's web was too tight. Maybe I had already lost. But then I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small, dust-covered cassette tape, one of those recordings, and as the faint outline of Daniel's voice crackled through the old player, bragging to Amy about how the old man will fold soon enough, he's too proud to fight, I realized the story had already begun to shift, because while he thought he was tightening the noose, he was tying it around his own neck, and all I had to do was hold it steady. The day of the hearing arrived under a gray Chicago sky that seemed to carry the weight of everything unsaid between fathers and sons, and as I buttoned my best suit, the same one I had worn when I closed the biggest deal of my career 20 years ago, I felt none of the nervous tremors Daniel had expected, only the cool steadiness of a man who had survived storms larger than one greedy child. And when I walked into that courtroom with its polished wooden benches and faint smell of dust and disinfectant, the whispers began again, just like at Miller's Diner, eyes turning toward me. But this time I didn't bow under them. I stood taller, because I knew the script Daniel had written was about to collapse on stage. He strutted in with Amy at his side, her expression brittle with determination, though her eyes darted toward me in hesitation, and he looked every bit the part of a son reluctantly doing the right thing, his voice syrupy as he greeted the judge, presenting documents and testimony that painted me as forgetful, incompetent, a relic unfit to hold the keys to my own life. And for the first hour I let him have the floor. I let him spin his story, even smiled faintly when he produced forged signatures and read aloud statements from so-called friends, because the more rope he gave himself, the tighter the knot grew. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, every creak in my bones echoing in the hushed chamber, and I began not with papers or lawyers, but with something older, something heavier. I pulled from my wallet the faded photograph, holding it up for the judge and the room to see, and I said, "This is my son Daniel, age 6, chocolate on his face. A boy who once told me he wanted to be just like me when he grew up. A boy I swore I'd protect, provide for, and guide. And I did. I built everything you see him trying to claim. But what he doesn't realize is that just as this picture has two sides, so does every story." I turned the photo over slowly, revealing the back where decades ago I had scrawled in ink, "For Daniel, someday this will remind you who you were before ambition made you cruel." The judge leaned forward, curious, and Daniel shifted uncomfortably. But I didn't let the silence stretch. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the old cassette recorder, setting it on the table with a solid thud, and as the tape played, Daniel's own voice filled the courtroom, mocking me, bragging to Amy about how easy it would be to make me look senile, about how, once I'm in control, nobody can touch us. And the gasps that rippled through the benches were like a tide breaking against his carefully built dam. Amy's face drained of color, her eyes widening as she realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in her brother's plan, and she turned to him, whispering something harsh that the microphones didn't catch, but her sudden movement away from his side was louder than any accusation. I could see Daniel's composure shatter, his jaw clenching, his words stammering as he tried to argue the recording was fake. But Carl was ready, sliding notarized transcripts across to the judge, evidence dated, authenticated, impossible to deny. And I watched as the courtroom shifted, the weight of judgment turning against him. Every person present seeing not an honorable son, but a con man caught in his own net. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, denying his petition, launching an investigation into fraud. And in that moment the empire Daniel thought he had seized crumbled beneath him, leaving him standing exposed, a man undone by his own hunger. But the real justice, the poetic sting, came not from the law but from the silence afterward, when Amy approached me with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't see it." And I handed her the photograph, pressing it into her palm, saying softly, "Keep it. Remember who we used to be, because I don't need it anymore." That was the first twist, the revenge delivered not just in his downfall, but in reclaiming my daughter's trust, in breaking the chain of manipulation he had wrapped around her. But the second twist was mine alone, quiet and inward, the realization that all those years of building, of fighting, of protecting, had not been wasted, even though my son had turned against me, because in the end, I hadn't lost myself. I hadn't lost the man I was, and while Daniel would spend his future in the shadow of his own choices, I walked out of that courthouse lighter, freer, as if the photograph's ink had finally dried and released me. And as the wind hit my face on the courthouse steps, carrying with it the smell of hot dogs from a vendor across the street, the metallic tang of winter on the air, I felt a rare thing for a man in his late 60s. Not just victory, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only when justice isn't handed to you, but carved out of betrayal with your own hands. And I knew then, with a clarity sharper than any deal I had ever signed, that Daniel Howell had destroyed Robert Holly in the diner that day, but Robert Holly had rebuilt himself here, in front of everyone, and for once the story ended not with silence, but with satisfaction. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.